This very first episode of the Audacity podcast is proudly sponsored by D. Joseph Design from djosephdesign.com, where you can get website design, presentation design, web hosting, all sorts of cool stuff. You have a message that deserves to look great, so make your next message look or sound great by hiring D. Joseph Design from djosephdesign.com. And let me give you a hint. It's actually me. So you're hiring me to do stuff for you. That sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Welcome to episode 1 of the Audacity podcast. You need pod to podcast. Welcome to this, the very first ever episode of the Audacity podcast. I'm Daniel Lewis, some places known as the Ramen Noodle. Well, in most places known as the Ramen Noodle, actually. And I am excited to finally have started this podcast, and this is launching in conjunction with the launch of my new podcasting networks, Noodle Mix, which is over at noodle.mx. No .com or .tv or anything like that. Noodle.mx. So check it out. It's going to be the new home of all 3 of my podcasts, The Ramen Noodle, Are You Just Watching? And now this new one, the Audacity podcast. And I have some ideas for another podcast I might start. I just might start it because no one else is doing it anymore. So I might jump in and I could be the one and only person podcasting this other content. But I will get to that far, far later in the future when I figure out if I'm going to do it. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for subscribing. However you've gotten to this site, I hope that you are subscribed to us, and you can subscribe over at noodle.mx, and you can subscribe to the entire all-inclusive almighty feed, or you can subscribe to just this individual feed and sign up for our newsletter and everything there. But let's get into this show, the Audacity to podcast. This is the very first episode, and I want to explain not only my purpose, but put out a roadmap of what we're going to cover in the near and far future in this podcast. First of all, the Audacity to podcast. It takes a lot of nerve, a lot of boldness to podcast, because really you're taking on big media. You might not have realized that, but you are. You are taking on big media. Let's be honest, you're a little person. When you start out, I'm a little person. You're a little person. Wouldn't you like to be a little person too? We're all little people. We're taking on big media, but we have a huge potential to do stuff that big media cannot do. But it takes a lot of audacity to do that. You have to have that boldness, that passion, that drive. And that's probably why you're here listening to this episode. The other thing, though, the reason why I named this podcast the Audacity to podcast is because I know that not many podcasters out there are talking about Audacity. Sure, there's an episode here or there talking about Audacity, but no one really talks a lot about Audacity. Now, this show won't focus entirely on Audacity. I'll be talking about all sorts of things, not just the software, the hardware, techniques, and all sorts of things. But when it comes down to editing software, I will be talking about Audacity a lot more than most other podcasters are. So having Audacity and podcast in the title, I'm hoping will bring a lot more listeners to the show who want to learn about how to podcast with Audacity, but how to do it successfully. And that's why I say in the tagline for this show, giving you the guts and teaching you the tools to podcast successfully. It may take you a little while to do it professionally, but at least I can help you do it successfully. Now, first of all, podcast. The name podcast has been debated years ago, but it's finally just settled on podcast. The guys from the Twit Network, This Week in Tech, Leo Laporte over there, tried to change it over to Netcast because podcast had some confusion over it. People ask, do you have to have an iPod to listen to a podcast? Or I don't have an iPod, or I don't have a Mac, or all of these different things. So the word podcast can sometimes have a misconception to it. But I think that it has gotten to the point that podcast is an accepted term. It was word of the year in 2006, I believe, or 2007. And podcasting is just another way of saying an internet broadcast. So it could be an internet radio show or an internet TV show. This, what I'm doing right now, is an internet radio show if you're listening to the recorded version, or if you're watching us live over at noodle.mx/live, then you're watching in a sense, the TV version, or you might be rewatching it through Ustream. Podcasting, though, does not require an iPod. Listening to podcasts does not require an iPod, and that is what is beautiful about it. It's on demand, listen to it anywhere kind of radio. I can listen to just my favorite things or not. I can delete things I don't want to listen to. I can skip through things. I can skip ads if I want to, like I often do in certain podcasts where they go on and on and on about ads. We'll talk about advertising in your podcast eventually. But I will tell you, it does require pod to podcast. No, not an iPod, not any other kind of pod, but it does require pod. P-O-D. Passion, organization, and dialogue. Passion is what is the most important thing for you to have in podcasting. If you are not passionate about what you're podcasting, then why are you podcasting? The reason I started this podcast, and even if you're listening to this episode, or if you visit the site near the launch of this episode in the middle of June, then you will notice that Noodle Mix site is not totally designed yet. It's kind of in a beta stage. I wanted to get this podcast launched, especially before PodCamp Ohio, which is on June 19, 2010. I am passionate about this topic. I have all sorts of things I want to talk about and I want to share with everyone, and different perspectives that I have on podcasting, or different workflows that I have on podcasting from others. I'm passionate about this. I've been podcasting since 2007, and I would say podcasting successfully since 2009, because that's when I really got serious about it. And I am passionate about this. This is fun. It's exciting. And so I want to tell others. When I listen to other podcasts and they mention something, and when I start talking back to the podcast saying, no, there's also this other way you could do it, or no, that's not the best way, or no, you got that terminology wrong, or these things, I realized I need to start my own podcast, not as competition. That's something I want to make clear, is this is not competition, because is there really competition in this field? I don't think so, because every person that comes to this field has a different type of passion and a different kind of background. So if you find an exact clone out there of Daniel Lewis, then I have competition. Everyone else has their own unique talents and abilities and their own backgrounds, and I have a very unique workflow and background, and everyone else does too. So I'm not looking at competition. I'm looking at sharing my passion with you and hoping that you get passionate too. When you podcast, you have to have passion. Look for those things. If you're trying to think about starting a podcast, look for the things that you're passionate about. When I am podcasting, I'm podcasting about comedy and funny things that happen in my life as a life amateur. That's the Ramen Noodle over at theramennoodle.com. I also love watching movies, and I'm a critical thinker, not meaning I criticize lots of things, but I think critically about what I'm watching and what is happening around me. So we've got the podcast, Are You Just Watching? I'm also passionate about podcasting, so I decided I've got to start a podcast about podcasting because I'm passionate. Your passion when you podcast is what can help hold you to a commitment in your flow. If you tell people that you're going to be a weekly podcast, then your passion will help drive that. Sometimes You need to even let your passion overpower your content or your confidence. What I mean by that, don't put out bad content. But there are certain times that in the ramen noodle, I know that my content isn't very funny. I know that not everyone is laughing hysterically like I would want them to. I know the content might be a little weak because of whatever reasons. Most of the time, it's just I didn't put enough preparation into it like I needed to. But still, my passion to be committed, my passion to continue producing episodes on a consistent basis is driving me to still sit behind this microphone. I guess I'm in front of the microphone. Sit in front of the microphone and record an episode every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time over at theramenoodle.com/live. Although that'll change soon over to Noodle Mix/live. You need a passion. And that passion will drive you to generate and find content. Look for things that you're passionate about. If you're podcasting about something and you're just not feeling passionate, maybe you should stop doing that podcast and look at podcasting something else. You have to have a passion. That passion is what will make people want to listen to you. Because when someone gets really excited about something, even if it's something you're not interested in, their enthusiasm is transmitted. It's an amazing thing that happens in humans, is that enthusiasm breeds enthusiasm. So if you podcast passionately about something, then others will hopefully get passionate about it too, and will be excited to listen to you and excited to get your podcast because you're just so passionate about it. So you need passion, you need organization, and you need dialogue. Let's talk about organization. You need to be professional. You need to have your thoughts organized. There's a podcast where, I won't mention the name of it, the content is good. The content is very similar to one of my podcasts. And I enjoy the content. But the person who is hosting the podcast is completely disorganized. And by the way, if you're thinking it's you, no, it's not you. Most likely it's not you, so you don't have to worry. But almost every other word out of his mouth is or and it's not just a subtle one, like saying that. No, his are blatantly there and so frequent. It just sounds like he's disorganized, that he has no confidence in himself, or not necessarily even a passion behind his voice, that he's just trying to converse. And the way he sounds is kind of like he's not really sure what he's gonna say next. Are you getting annoyed yet? I'm not saying you have to be a professional speaker. I do come from a background of professional speaking, so that's why certain things like this stand out to me a little bit more, and why I've tried very hard to remove some of those things from my own language. But do listen to yourself to try and find those verbal crutches that you may have, those things that are distracting to your content. And make sure that your thoughts are organized. If you can just pause for a couple more seconds and think first about what you're going to say, it would be better to have those pauses than to have constant and all of that. Because there is a way in Audacity to easily remove long pauses, and I will show people that eventually. You also need to have your notes and your sites together and be organized in how you present them. It bothers me when people are podcasting and they suddenly realize, oh, I wanted to share something with you, but I have no idea where it is. Let me go look for it. And just sitting or standing, whatever, driving, walking, running, whatever, listening to this episode, and you're thinking, okay, I'm waiting. Can we keep moving on? Now, yes, sometimes you can't have all of your stuff together at the same time. In my podcast, Are You Just Watching?, we normally get our scripture verses and bullet points and things we want to talk about in quotations. We get that all together before we start the episode. But what often happens is while we're recording the episode, suddenly a thought comes to our mind and we think of a scripture verse that we want to share within the episode. So what I do, instead of trying to circle around the issue like a buzzard or something, is I take a organized approach. Is I suddenly just pause the recorder. I let my co-host know, I let Eve know that the recorder is paused while I look at a scripture, and it gives us a moment to regather our thoughts, and then I resume recording. It's an organized way, and for you, the listener, you don't notice a disorganization there. It sounds like it's perfectly organized, and it also reduces my production time when I'm organized. A couple years ago, when I was doing the ramen noodle very sporadically, sporadic, I wasn't consistent with the ramen noodle. I scripted every episode, episodes 1 through 8 of the ramen noodle were totally scripted, and I would perform that script verbatim, which presented a huge editing challenge, a huge load of work to prepare for the podcast, perform it, and then edit it. And that's why I didn't release episodes very often, because of how much work was involved. And my flow for all of this wasn't very organized. I wasn't on a schedule. I didn't have all my thoughts together necessarily. Now, in the ramen noodle, when I decided to commit to being weekly and going live every Monday night, which really helped with the consistency, is that people know that they can trust, for the most part, that I will be live Monday nights at 8 Eastern Time at noodlemix/live. I also have segments within it, so it's not just a rambling thing, but there are certain segments that I go along, and there's a general flow to it of organized thoughts. Sure, sometimes it seems a little disorganized. We have fun with that because it's comedy. But try to have your own thoughts organized in what you share. Be professional, have your sites and show notes together. And in the chat room, they're saying, except for this week. Yeah, except for this week. That's because I had to prepare and I had to organize for this episode. Sorry for making your week all messed up. The third thing, and it's a good thing that I was just noticing the chat room right now, because this relates to the third thing. So you need passion, you need organization, you need dialogue. There are a couple ways to get dialogue. First of all, let me help you understand what I mean and why this is important. Big media, like the TV stations or the newspapers or the magazines, they're pretty much one way. You out there are the consumer. You're not a contributor necessarily. You are not an author. Very rarely does your opinion necessarily matter to what they're doing on big media. Your voice is very, very rarely going to be heard. Whereas social media contains podcasting. Podcasting is social media, which means podcasting is social. And social means you connect with people. When you do a podcast, by the nature of being social media, you need to try and connect with people, have a dialogue with people. Now, that doesn't always mean a direct conversation back and forth, but some ways that you could have dialogue in your podcast is get a co-host. It's a really easy way to make your podcast flow with a dialogue. I look at the ramen noodle, and there are times when Jeremy, my co-host, cannot make it to the ramen noodle. And I just feel like those episodes are really lagging. For one thing, I'll tell a joke. I have no idea if it's funny, if it's stupid, or anything based on someone's reaction until the 10-second or so delay that the chat room and Ustream have. And so about 10 seconds later, I might see someone type in LOL. Now, Notice, I also mentioned a chat room. Of course, the only way you can have a chat room while you are podcasting is if you podcast live. I highly recommend podcasting live because it helps with this dialogue, and it helps people know that you're consistent and they can start relying, for the most part, on you being live at a certain time each day of the week, or certain days of the week, whatever, certain day of the month. It also gives you an opportunity to connect with your audience. Later on in this series of the Audacity podcast, I will be taking more and more conversations or questions from the audience through the chat room as I'm talking about things, and someone in the chat room might ask a question. Well, what about this? Or what do you think of this? And then that will change the direction of the podcast. I will be podcasting for your needs. And that's the awesome thing about social media is what you want it to be, because you are contributing. You are generating the content that others are helping to distribute. So you can send me questions here at Noodle Mix. Send them to feedback@noodle.mx or call in to 859-353-4332. And what's awesome is when you send these things in, I might have a plan. Like I've got right now, talk about organization. I have the next 35 episodes written out, major themes that I want to talk about for the next 35 episodes of the Audacity podcast. That's almost a year. 35 episodes I have planned out. But I might have something on here that I'm not planning to cover until, let's see, what's number 29 in here is show notes. How to write good show notes and the importance of show notes. Maybe if you email in to feedback@noodle.mx, or if you call in to 859-353-4332, and you do that in the next couple weeks, and you say, I've really been wondering, how important are my show notes, and should I just write out, transcript my entire episode, or should I just have bullet points, or should I have paragraphs? What good are my show notes? If you send that in as a question, then that's going to bump that up in priority to maybe next week's episode, maybe a month away. And it will be meeting your needs in hopefully a timely manner. My friend Cliff Ravenscraft over at podcastanswerman.com, who is very much an inspiration to me, and much of my equipment I've purchased through him, he often has a backlog of questions and requests that come in through email or voicemail and all of this other stuff through his forums, and it gives him content to podcast about. And it's a way that he's able to dialogue with his listeners, to connect with his listeners, with his audience on a personal level. I can start calling my listeners by name. Like in the chat room right now, we've got Chuck, we've got Kay, we've got Faye, we've got Kylie Mack, we've got Ray was in here earlier, we've got Eric, and these people that I'm getting to know on a first name basis, and I know things about them, which is just awesome. I love that I know things about my listeners and know what they're doing and even consider them friends. That dialogue in a podcast is what will bring people back and help them connect with you and feel more a part of the show and more part of the community as you begin to start a community around your podcast or podcasts. So you need passion, you need organization, and you need dialogue. That's what I consider the pod to podcast. You don't need an iPod, but you do need passion. You don't need an iPod, but you do need organization. You don't need an iPod, but you do need to have a dialogue with your audience, with your listeners. Connect with these people on their level, and you will see your podcast grow, and it will help you during those downtimes, during those times that you might not feel like podcasting. That community that you build by following pod, passion, organization, and dialogue, that community will help lift you up and sometimes even give you the content that you can podcast or share your opinion about. So let me give you an idea of some of the things that are coming in the next 35 episodes of the Audacity podcast. We'll be talking about benefits of PodCamps. I'm going to PodCamp, Ohio. By the time that most people listen to this, I'll have been at PodCamp, Ohio, and I may put some of those recordings in here as bonus shows. There are things about software audio enhancement that you'd probably love to learn. How can you make your audio sound better after you've already recorded it? What about WordPress, and what kind of plugins should you use with WordPress? Or what are some ways that you can generate a good audio promo for your podcast? What podcast directories are important and how can you get in them? What's the whole thing about RSS and FeedBurner and subscriptions and stats and all of that? What are some good practices when you're generating URLs for your podcast, the little web addresses and such? What about advertising in your podcast? What are some ways to improve the quality of your podcast with equipment? What are some recommended equipments that you can get? Equipment, rather. What are the benefits of blogging or Twitter along with your podcast? How can you effectively podcast live? How do you analyze things like with Google Analytics or some advanced analytics and campaigns? What are some good WordPress themes, or how can you get a WordPress template? This and a whole bunch more. I've got 35 things on my list. And for those right now in the live show over at noodle.mx/live, I am holding up my list to show. I've got a 2-page list here with 35 items on it of things to podcast about. But you have the power to change what I podcast about. Email feedback at Email feedback at noodle.mx or call 859-353-4332. And I mentioned WordPress themes. I want you to take a look at Noodle Mix, noodle.mx. Take a look at the theme there. Yes, at the time of this recording, it is still very beta. It's kind of like a wireframe. But this is a theme that I am developing, not totally from scratch, but by the time I finish it, it will be pretty much by scratch. This is a theme that I am creating specifically with a podcast in mind, or multiple podcasts. My plan is eventually to offer this theme as a premium theme that people can purchase for podcasts, because there aren't really any good themes out there designed specifically for podcasters or podcast networks. So take a look at it. And at some point, I will be looking for beta testers who would be willing to try the theme as I start to unlock things. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and email feedback at noodle.mx or call in 859-353-4332. And I also want you to sign up for the newsletter. I will be eventually putting out a newsletter, a Noodle Mix newsletter, and I can promise you that I probably won't do any more than once a week. It might be more like once a month when I start out, or every 2 weeks. But I do want you to take a look at it. You can go over to noodle.mx and either sign up at the bottom of the site or over on the right side where you'll see the little envelope with the familiar email icon there. So you can jump over there and subscribe via email, and that'll put you on the newsletter, let you know what's going on, let you know what you might have missed if you didn't subscribe. Make sure you're also subscribed via RSS feed, and you can subscribe through all sorts of means. The show isn't in iTunes yet, but it will be there very, very soon, I hope. So thank you for joining, and please tell someone else about the podcast, about the multiple podcasts. We've got The Ramen Noodle. TheRamenNoodle.com is a comedy podcast, seasoning packets of comedy to flavor your day. We've got Are You Just Watching, which is critical thinking for the entertained Christian. And now we have the Audacity to Podcast, giving you the guts and teaching you the tools to podcast successfully. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at twitter.com/theramennoodle. I'll be making any network announcements through that, so don't worry about trying to find a network Twitter account. I think I'll be doing that. I might change my mind, but you can follow me, twitter.com/theramennoodle. And subscribe to our shows. Check out the site. Yes, I know there are bugs. And I hope that you, as you go out and perhaps prepare to podcast, that you will do it with passion, organization, and dialogue. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Daniel Lewis. Talk to you next time.